Now I'm very glad to give floor to my good colleague Mart Susi, who is Professor of Human Rights Law here in Tallinn University, and his academic career is marked by significant contributions to the study and promotion of human rights, particularly in the context of digital environments. Professor Susi holds a position as the leader of the Global Digital Human Rights Network, where his work focuses on the intersection of human rights and digital technologies. He also was elected as a member of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights in 2022. So, floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Niklas. It's a pleasure to speak after Professor Roig, because what my esteemed colleague started with is almost the same. I was going to talk about myself, but I have no possibility to change the slides. But as you noticed, Professor Roig mentioned a very important aspect, namely that technology may change law to the extent that we do not recognize it, or what we recognize may be not exactly the law and legal norms to which we are accustomed from the offline, or let's say traditional space. And Professor Roig also suggested that new theories may be needed to address that situation. And here I am to introduce one of the possible new theories to address that situation. Namely, I'm going to introduce on the basis of a monography which was or appeared just at the beginning of this year by Cambridge University Press, titled The Non-coherence Theory of Digital Human Rights. So bear a bit with me when I'm going to open some main elements of the theory. Now, when a new theory is to be introduced, sometimes it's easier to try to capture its essence not through purely legal arguments, but with something else. So I chose also in the introduction of my monography and here in this talk some situations of which we all know. So, for instance, we all have studied Aristotelian logic at school. And we know that there is a rule that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, because it is in the nature of Aristotelian logic. When we speak about the transformation of law from offline to online space, we may find that this logic does not hold. A may equal B, B may equal C, but A may not equal C. That's the distortion which happens. The second logic, or the second example, would be Plato's myth of the cave. You may remember the famous Greek philosopher Plato was describing the way how we understand reality, namely that we are all sitting in the cave and we don't see the sun, but there is an opening above us, and there are some people who walk outside in the sun and they carry certain objects, and the sun reflects the shadows of these objects on the wall of the cave, and what we do, we describe to one another the shadows and try to guess what the objects really look like, but in reality we do not know. That is one way how to think about the transformation of law from offline to online space. And finally, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. Maybe one of the favorite books you may have had. You remember what Alice was facing with. When she wanted to run very fast away from somewhere, she had to stand. And when she had to be at one place, she was compelled to run. So it's a different logic. Now, I just give you one example, or start with discussing how certain core elements of law and change when we compare offline and online domains. We know that in the traditional legal thinking, we often go back to famous philosophers, and we know that Immanuel Kant has defined dignity as an end in itself. What does it mean? It means that dignity is not relative, and it stands as the basis of constructing legal architecture and also constructing the architecture of fundamental rights. It is something which is not questioned. But in the digital domain, we may find that this assumption is challenged. We may find that in the digital domain, dignity loses its absolute nature, and it can be subject to being balanced, let's say, against privacy or freedom of expression. There are many examples in my book about that. So one of the claims we can make that dignity as a core assumption, which is an absolute assumption from offline domain, may become relativized in the digital domain. I give you another example of privacy, how, and it may help to explain my assertion that the laws are different. I refer to the dual nature of digital privacy, and I need to walk closer to the screen because it is so small I cannot see. Now, how you may have, or you may know where the formulation of privacy in the offline domain is coming from. It comes from a very famous book, Warren and Brandeis, written and then published in Harvard Law Review in, I think it was in 1886, yes, about 130 years ago. And the claim which they made introducing the idea of privacy is that it is the entitlement or the interest to be let alone. Not left alone, but to let alone. And why? Because we enter, all of us enter offline domain involuntarily. None of us has decided to be born. It's the Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialist assumption. But when we speak about the digital domain, we enter digital domain voluntarily. Yes, nobody compels us to enter digital domain. We may, of course, in abstract reflect whether it is possible to operate outside of digital domain, but still we enter voluntarily. So my claim would be that the very meaning of privacy in the online domain changes. It assumes a dual nature which it doesn't have in the offline domain. Because in the digital privacy, we see a combination of two entries. We see voluntary entry and we see involuntary entry. Voluntary entry means that we want to use maybe social media and we want to use emails to enable us to communicate easier. Involuntary entry means that despite of what we think or want to do, there are different e-governance solutions, different blockchain solutions which store our data, do we want it or not. Now, yes, what is it doing? Okay. So the idea of the non-coherence theory of digital human rights, in a nutshell, that we believe, or I believe, that we have a distorted image of law, of normativity, legal principles, if we compare the two domains. And there are ontological and epistemic aspects of that, because we can see that, well, for instance, if we speak about privacy, or already talked about privacy, but we see that meaning of privacy becomes much narrower in the digital domain in comparison with the offline domain. We can also see that the meaning of freedom of expression changes. Now I don't remember in what slide I have it, so I will speak from the memory because I have too many slides. So I can go also back here. One of the ideas of the core ideas, which also Professor Roik mentioned about, and you all know, is based on the idea that certain entitlements or certain relative rights are of equal weight. Yes, it's a very classical assumption that when we start to balance, for instance, freedom of expression against the right to privacy, the starting point is that they carry equal weight. We see that this assumption changes when we enter the digital domain. We see two opposites. We see that the global internet companies, big players like Facebook, YouTube, X, and the others, despite what they say, they give more weight to freedom of expression. Yes, they may a bit deceive us and say that they have different community standards and advisory boards, but still at the end of the day, freedom of expression prevails. The other extreme would be perhaps the GDPR, because if something goes to the extreme, you always see that something happens on the other extreme. The General Data Protection Regulation, in my view, protects privacy and gives priority to privacy over the freedom of expression. So we see here that there is the distortion of the initial equal weight of both of these rights. Let me see. I will, yes. I have advanced in my monography several theses. I will just introduce them very briefly here. One of them is the inadequacy of protection thesis, which means that the way how human rights law and fundamental rights law protects us in the offline domain is not any longer adequate and sufficient in the digital domain. The multi-stakeholderism whale thesis is nothing else as to say that when we see that the big internet companies are playing the game, when they create different advisory boards and issue standards, they in fact are not interested in anything else as self-normativity. And I would now have here yes. I have here another interesting thesis which I advance in the monography, and I make no secret. Currently, I'm writing a new monograph exactly on this topic. It is a bit difficult, but bear with me. You may have heard about the quantum mechanics and quantum physics. What does it say? It says that, and some people won Nobel Prize of quantum physics a few years ago. Quantum physics says that two particles exist in pairs. And even if there are thousands of light years difference between them, if one object changes, the other object changes to the different way. So you only need to know that you need to only to follow the changes in one object. So for instance, if we can say that the sum of rights of A and B is always 1, and if one decreases by 0.2, the other increases to 0.8. It has to be empirically tested, but I'm not certain that it fully holds in the digital domain. Let me go further on and, yes, speak here. Professor Raig also mentioned about the normative validity. Where does the normative validity of law come from, and whether there are differences in comparison with digital and non-digital domains. We know, many of you are law students here, we know where the normative validity of law in offline domain comes from. In the digital domain, because of the technological companies, the situation is different. We see the phenomenon of self-normativity. What does self-normativity mean? Self-normativity means that companies create the law for themselves. They do not transpose fully legal regulation from offline domain, but they create the rules. And right now, already for several years, there is also the discussion that self-normativity may lead to self-constitutionality. Self-constitutionality of big digital players, which means that now suddenly we have two constitutional systems. We have the traditional constitutional system in front of us, and then we have self-constitutional system which operates in the digital space. And now I would, yes, so self-normativity, if we go further into detail, self-normativity can mean two things. It can mean that it applies only to concrete legal norms. Self-normativity means that Facebook or Meta, YouTube, different digital domains, they create specific norms. But as you know, norms are at a lower layer than principles. They still follow principles which come from the offline space. But self-normativity in broader sense means that also the principles which apply in the non-digital domain would change. Now, here is a trick. The trick is that the language of rights remains the same. So if we speak about the right to privacy, if we speak the right to exchange information, the terminology is one, but the actual content of that terminology may be different. Now, I would now come and show to you that, yes, here is another aspect. I talked about that, but one of the hypotheses which I also advance in my monography is to question whether the division of human rights into absolute and relative rights is retained in the digital domain. And it's a long sentence, you don't need to read it, but affirmation of the statement that the division of rights into absolute and relative ones is retained shows that the non-coherence or distortion of digital human rights law in comparison with non-digital human rights law is not that very big variance. But if we say that this division is not carried over, we would see an image of human rights law in the digital domain which is flat. One layer is missing. And that would be perhaps, I personally believe that that is the case, that we wouldn't be able to claim that there are absolute human rights anymore in the digital domain. Now I switch to something completely different. And I do it because I have always told to my students that if you remember 10 or 15% of what you were told in a lecture or in a seminar, then it's a good thing. And now I switch to something which is related to not exactly to non-coherence theory, but something else. And for that reason, I need to switch over the slides. And I would like to introduce something which is, or as you can see from the screen, I would like to introduce an idea and propose a new human right, which would be a right not to use the internet. That would run or that would speak about the possibility of people to continue in their traditional way of life. It is an idea which has been on the, perhaps on the table or in the discourse, not only from 2024, but already a few years ago. Some people, including myself, we have written about that. But I think it fits very well into the Death of Law conference because we may not want to be euthanized, and we may want to continue using law as we know it. So what is at the core of the right not to use the internet? The second bullet point. It says that this right is about the entitlement not to be forced to use the internet for conducting one's official business with the state, nor for obtaining vital services from private companies. The first part we all understand, but the second part, the vital services from private companies, we may still have the possibility to walk into the bank and not use the e-banking, or we may still wish to have the possibility to communicate with the tax authority by going there and not filling our tax returns. The right not to use the internet is not the guarantee for the right to a decision by a human. You may know that there is an emerging right already recognized in some instruments, that every one of us, all of us, have the right to a decision by a human. They are not fully comparable, they do not overlap, because if you don't use the internet, you may still have the possibility that a machine decides some aspect of your claim. And the fourth bullet point, which you see here, is that this right should be viewed as a shield against the increasing pressures to conduct all businesses with governments in the digital domain. And how it develops, I believe that at the moment, this idea not to use the internet is at the stage of an idea. It is getting some discussion, but it is not recognized anywhere. Now, I will put this always when we speak at academic conferences, we need to show a theoretical basis. I would put this idea not to use the internet into a figure which I believe some of my students have seen, and I have written about that in one of my writings, called as the decrease in universality and abstractness thesis, and it is a reflection how human rights develop nowadays. You see, we know from Robert Alexi's definition that all human rights, among other things, are supposed to be abstract and universal. And we see that the way how human rights develop today is that they become more and more concrete and they become more and more individual. And at one point, the concreteness and the individuality gets to the point that no longer we could justify them as being sufficiently abstract and sufficiently universal. Where to place the right not to use the internet, I am at this stage not fully certain if we can justify it as a self-standing human right, or whether we could justify it as an interpretation or the derivation of the right to obtain and to good governance, and the right to depart with information. Now, there are two ways, or there are several other theoretical approaches how to think about human rights development. One of them, which is, I believe, very universally used, is American scholars Phil Alston's quality control idea, which he published in 1984. And his quality control idea doesn't use quantitative standards. It speaks about the fact that a new human right should represent highly important social value. It should find perhaps support by different international players. It should be distinctly clear, and it could provide, or it could get support from different governments and courts. Now, if I have been reflecting about Alston's quality control approach, then it is possible that we could argue that the right not to use the internet could be justified. I would also think that despite of the vast geopolitical problems we have today in the world, where United Nations is almost not able to agree on any new human rights documents, just a fact for students to know, the last hard law human right instrument which the United Nations adopted was in 2006. After that, there have been some soft law instruments, but it's almost 20 years past when the United Nations was able to come to an agreement about a hard law document. But here, perhaps geopolitical differences would not be so vast. So using Alston's approach, I could say that the right not to use an internet can be justified as a new human right. Now, when we apply the decrease in universality and abstractness thesis, I would think that it leads to a contrary approach, because although we could say that perhaps universally everybody would agree that it is such an important right, it remains, in my view, highly concrete. And there are doubts if it can be justified as a human right. So this is all. I'm very glad to say that I have saved 2 minutes additionally for the coffee break, and very happy to continue the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.